Well, we got the first week down and done behind us. Only got 6 more to go. But as you have seen, that format is the way all of the lessons are going to be. You will have the 2 chapters, you'll have the quizzes and the short essay questions, although every other week you will have a test. So when we finish chapter 3 and 4, there will be a test. Meanwhile, let's get on with it. Chapter 3, Creating Anglo-America between 1660 and 1750. Now, by the end of the 1600s, it was kind of, well, I guess you'd say, apparent to the English rulers that the colonies were capable of generating a lot of wealth, so they moved to seize control of the trade. They wanted to consolidate its hold on the continent's eastern coast and greater regulate its empire. Colonies had been pretty much left to themselves. It was acting out of something called mercantilism, in which the government regulates the economic activity to promote their own national power. They encourage manufacturing of certain things, like one of the things that they told the colonies that they could do, they could not produce iron because that would be in competition with England. They could not produce beaver hats. They had to send the beaver back to England to have the hats produced. But for the most part, anything to do with wood or products made here or something you could get here like cotton or tobacco that you couldn't get over there, they would even pay a bounty for you to make it. The main reason behind this mercantilism, it's a very simplified definition. What you want to do, you want to keep all your gold and silver in country. So you want to have an imbalance of trade. So if you can have your own people make something that you need, it keeps the money in-house, so to speak. So you don't want to buy any French lace because then you have to pay France gold. You want more coming into the country than going out. This is just a quick map to show you how the colonies are grouped along the eastern coast. And as you can see, all the pink is English. All that yellow to the east, or to the west rather, is French dominated. Well, the French and the Spanish both are claiming some of that land, but we're just hugging the coastline. We don't even cross the Cumberland Mountains at this point in time. Now, before we get into the text, I'm going to do a real quick little review to remind you of some of the things we talked about last lesson, and also to ask you some questions. And I'm sure that these questions have been on your mind considerably this week. Where did we get our form of government? And where did the English colonists get the desire for self-rule? Well, indirectly, they all came out of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Now, these things are direct results of things that happened in England. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, and those of you who have had European history, you'll be familiar with the Norman Conquest, 1066 Common Era. Henrys the First and the Second, long before the 7th and 8th came along, back in 1189 Common Era, they decided that since they were going to rule England, they needed to have a uniform code of law instead of each area having their own laws and nothing written down. And it developed into, or metamorphosed into, something they call the common law system. In 1216 Norman Conquest, it's one of the Crusades, I think it's the third one. King Richard the Lionheart, now you've all heard stories about him, it's during the Robin Hood day. He's away. And while he's away fighting the Crusades, his brother John rules England. And brother John is bad. Bad, bad, bad. Because of the bad things he's doing, the nobles are going to force him to sign something called the Magna Carta. You see, there's a tug of war between the nobles and the English monarchy over power struggle. And this absolute tendency that the kings had, for they figured that it was nobody but God and them. The God and then the king, and then everybody else is beneath them, and the king makes all the rules. But the legislature felt that they should have some rights. So in this Magna Carta, you're going to end up having something called the House of Commons. And the House of Commons is a group of people who are elected. And the House, England, meanwhile, is neglecting her colonies because of the internal problems. But this Magna Carta forced the king to give 60 concessions, and one of them being that the king was not above the law, that what the law for the land, you shall not commit murder, was just as good for the king as it was for you and me and the common people. It also created something called the Great Council, which is going to advise the king on how to do things. Now, this Magna Carta is going to develop into what we call Parliament. And in Parliament, we're going to have these checks and balances. You're going to have a House of Lords, which the only way you can get into that is if you're born a noble person, and the House of Commons, which is the elected assembly. And it's really the House of Commons that's going to have a lot of power. They're the ones who has the power of the purse, as we decided. They're the ones who can tax. Quickly going over some of the dynasties. The Tudor dynasty, Henry VII started it. His son, Henry VIII, leaves the Catholic Church and starts the Anglican Church. He dies. His son takes over, lasts about 5 years and dies. And then Queen Mary takes over. And they call her Bloody Mary because she wants to take England back to being Catholic. And the Protestants who could afford to left. And these people were called Marian exiles because they left under Mary, Queen Mary. She dies childless. Queen Elizabeth becomes the Queen, the Virgin Queen. The exiles return, only now they're called Puritans because they want to purify the Church of England. And they are still too Catholic. And some of them agree to settle in the New World. She dies. King James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, and he's an absolutist. Presbyterian, which is even worse than being in the Church of England. He hated the Puritans. He did everything he could to, shall we say, make their life hell. And there was a massive migration called the Great Migration, but he did rule for 22 years. He dies. His son, Charles I, takes over. Charles I is even a worse absolutist than his father was, and there was a continual battle with Parliament over taxation because he kept wanting to tax, and Parliament said no. He ruled for 11 years, and there was a civil war. The Puritans, led by Oliver Cromwell, rise up, overthrow the king, arrest him, try him, behead him, and his family is forced to flee to France. A man named Cromwell, the Lord Protector, takes over the government, and for 15 years he had a lot of reforms, and some of them were good. He wanted to make England a good Protestant country, or Puritan country, in his own image. He did let a lot of people out of jail. He did insist that everyone should have an education, including women, children, girl children. But when he dies, his son got to take over, and his son he didn't have the respect of the army, he didn't have the respect of Parliament, and it didn't work. So the nobles get together and go over to France and contact Charles I's son, who's living in France, who's Charles II, and invite him to come be king. Well, you're asking yourself, why in the world would I go to a country that had beheaded my dad? For the simple reason you've been living off the generosity of the King of France. You're a king with nothing to rule, and everything has to be kind of approved by the King of France before you can even spend any money. Take a chance. Go back and be king of your own country, which he did. He ruled peacefully, letting Parliament pretty much make the decisions for 25 years, but when he dies, he has no children. So they go back and ask his other brother, a younger brother, James II, to rule. Bad move. Oh, was that a bad move? He's old. He's 52 when he became king. He'd been living in, 25 and 17. Oh, what's that? 2, 3, almost 50 years he'd been living in France. So he was very much a Catholic. He hated the English, especially the Parliament. He had been married. He married a Protestant girl, and she died. And then he married again and married a Catholic woman, and she didn't have any children. So they finally come to England and rule, and he makes promises, but the first thing he does is start bringing his Catholic friends in, which really irritated. It kind of kicked him off big time, because they worked so hard to make the country Protestant, they didn't need this. And they don't know what to do, but then he's old, he's in his 50s, he's going to die soon, and we'll worry about who's going to become king after that. And one day when they come to work, they have the queen is holding a baby. I think I told you the bedpan story last time. And who's going to call the king a liar when he says his wife had a baby? Now, everyone knew it wasn't her child. She was in her 50s. She'd never had a child before. There was no evidence of a child being born. There wasn't any bloody sheets, or no one was there. Just she went to bed one night okay and got up next morning with a baby. Got there. Well, this was more than Monarchy could ask. I mean, now we had an heir, a Catholic heir. We can't have this. So they go back to France and asked James's first wife, who was Protestant, children, had girls, if they would come become Queen of England. And Mary said, no, I won't come unless you let my husband come and be king. And William of Orange and Mary, yes, it's the one William and Mary College was named after. What you probably did not know is that Mary's mother and William's father were brother and sister, so they're really cousins. They did not have any children. Now, before we go any further, I want to reiterate this. The colonists did not think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as Englishmen. Over here, we had 3 types of colonies established. The joint stock, or proprietary colony, which stockholders decide who's going to be the governor. The corporate is decided by the people who own the corporation, who the governor is. And you never started out as a royal colony. You were only a royal colony after you had your charter pulled. Again, the colonists believed they had all the rights of Englishmen in England. I can't reiterate that enough. Colonists did not think of themselves as Americans. They were Englishmen living in the Americas. Like I said, the governor is appointed or elected. He has the power of veto. He has the militia. He enforces the laws. He appoints officials. He can give out contracts. But the key here is he gets his pay from the elected assembly. So that's the one thing the council has a whip hand over the governor. They can force him to do things by withholding his pay. There is a council, which is kind of like our Senate. They're not elected. They're just friends, so to speak, of the governor who advise him on things. The assembly is elected, and as I said, has the power of the purse. And the power of the purse simply means they have the power to tax. The law in all the colonies was a basic law, a common law, or biblical law. We had no jail, so punishment had to be very swift. Get it over with. Now back to your text. Now I think this time I tried to follow the text pretty closely, so if you have the desire and want to, you should be able to follow this lecture from your text. It won't be word for word, of course, but it'll be close. Excuse me. Well, the English are trying to wrest control from the Dutch. They just don't like the Dutch being a small nation as they are and having as much power as they do, so they used the Navigation Acts in 1651, which I thought was kind of cute. In other words, everything that's made in the colonies, coming out of the colonies, that has to be shipped to England in English ships and in English ports, and there they would pay taxes on it before they could go anywhere else. Wow, that's cool. So if the Dutch wanted to buy something made in America, or buy some of our tobacco or something, they couldn't do it unless they bought it from the English. 9 years later, King Charles II expanded his reach. He chartered something called the Royal African Slave Company. Well, it didn't have the slave, it was Royal African Company, which was a slave company, and all of a sudden they've got a monopoly on the slave trade. Then they had a war with the Dutch. It's about the third or fourth one they've had. And this time the Dutch lost totally, and England got all of the Dutch colonies and things in the New World. They got New Amsterdam. They also got a lot of Dutch trading posts in Africa, which helped. So New Amsterdam now becomes New York, and of course the whole area was given to the Duke of York, the king's brother. And New Amsterdam, or New York, is going to become a military base where they can launch raids into Canada and France. And they began to restrict the freedoms in New York City. There was a lot of freedoms in New Amsterdam. But now, for instance, the women who were married, their rights were eliminated. And free blacks were totally discriminated against. They were no longer allowed to join the militia or have guns or do anything. Meanwhile, they formed an alliance with the Iroquois Indians in the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley region. And they're expanding their reach inch by inch into what the area that the French are controlling and claiming, and it's going to cause big problems. But meanwhile, residents of New York, the Dutch and the English, they're complaining of being denied their English liberties. After all, they are Englishmen, right? The main thing being the right to consent to taxation. So the Duke of York, in one of those few times when he decided to be human, if you would, he agreed to something called the Charter of Liberties, which reaffirmed the traditional English rights. Now, we talked about the founding of Charleston last chapter, but one of the things we did not mention was the problem the settlers had with the Yanksee and Creek Indians. Of course, there was a lot of people killed, but the problem, if you would, and I put parentheses around the problem, because you can't see my hands, go problem, and the Indians were forcibly pushed into Florida, which is going to cause problems later on with a man called Andrew Jackson. And because of this, Carolina's become a very rich rice-growing colony. It's going to wind up being the wealthiest of all the North American colonies. The last colony founded in the 1600s was, of course, Pennsylvania, and the founder being William Penn, who was a Quaker who basically wanted a refuge and a place for religious liberty for his Quaker friends. He called his colony the Holy Experiment. And he formed an assembly of male taxpayers and freemen, but there were some restrictions. However, the majority of the colony's men could vote. And they sold land at incredibly, the prices were just ridiculously low, and they began to attract immigrants from all over. A lot of them came in from Germany. That's why we have the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, all this cheap land and people coming in sounds good, but when you've got a choice of going to Pennsylvania where you can buy cheap land or going down to Carolina, where are you going to choose? You're going to go to Pennsylvania. So you're having a shortage of laborers in the South, and indirectly it's going to foster more slavery in the South because the Southern plantation owners are going to have to buy slaves because the indentures are not coming down to work. But Pennsylvania problems don't come up right away. They don't come up a little bit later. And the colony is very, very prosperous. And they treat the Indians with respect and buy their land. I thought this was a really cute. I keep seeing the old man back there sound asleep on his cane. Reminds me of some of the church services I've been to. The women are paying attention, but some of the men just are kind of, you can almost hear them snore. Origins of American slavery. That's, I know you're not going to like this statement, but English did not intend to rely on slaves as labor. This was not their original intention. They were going to go with convicts, Indians, indentures. But the growing demand for labor for the tobacco, it put them in a position they really had no choice. Number one, the slave was a slave for life, and he didn't have to be set free, whereas the indenture, once his contract was up, you had to give him freedom dues as well as set him free. So you've got to get another worker. For the slave, escape was going to be difficult because of the skin color. Because in the area they were in, there was either the Redskins or it was the white man. So the black man would stand out. And the most wonderful two things about the black men from Africa is they were immune to so many of the diseases that were killing people over here. And they already knew how to farm. Because being a farmer in Africa was the highest social standing you could have. So myself as a plantation owner, economically, buying a slave is the best investment I can make. I'm not going to turn him loose. He's mine till he dies. If it's a female and she has a child, that's a free slave for me. So why would I choose to buy an indenture that I want to let go in 5 years, or to invest in a man I can keep for the rest of his life? Economics, folks. And I know you're not going to like this. In the beginning, the English were not racist. They did not discriminate on somebody because of the color of their skin. They believed that certain races were superior and entitled to rule. They thought they were superior over the Irish, and we discussed the Irish prisoner and slaves. They knew that they were superior over the Native Americans. And, of course, they were superior over the African Americans. Now, some races were civilized and some were barbarian. They divided them in half. Some races were Christian, some were not. And, of course, the non-Christian and Catholics fit into that area. But the African, because of all these reasons, was very... Oh, I wonder what that was supposed to be. He's supposed to be a slave. He cannot be educated. Now, slavery has existed for all of human history. The ancient Greeks and Romans had slaves. And we wouldn't have democracy if we didn't have slavery in the ancient days, because you can't go out there and work in the fields 12, 14 hours a day and come home and think intelligent thoughts and how to plan governments and how to make medicines up. So we have to have slaves to do the work so we have time to sit and ponder these important decisions. And, of course, slavery is in the Bible. We saved these black people from being barbarians in Africa, and we introduced them to Christianity. And they were not suited to be free. I mean, they were too childlike, and they couldn't be educated. These are all legitimate reasons, you know. Now, slavery grew rapidly in Brazil and the West Indies because they needed slaves for the big sugar plantation. Meanwhile, it's growing very slowly in North America. Whereas in the beginning in North America, white and black indentures were the majority of the labor force. And no matter what you heard, less than 5% of the African slaves out of Africa were sent to the North American colonies. 95% went to the West Indies and to Brazil. But even with just that 5%, we begin to see large white plantation owners growing, prospering, and dominating politics and society. Now, slave in Spain, well, sometimes the church encouraged the people to free the slaves. And just when they were freed, they had some rights. But the English colonies, the slaves had no rights, and they were not encouraged to be freed. In 1619, the first slaves arrived in the Chesapeake area, and they were treated as indentures, and it was a Dutch ship that had been blown off course. And in the beginning, the black and white worked alongside each other. Yes, some slaves did run away, but some stayed and became free. Some stayed and became friends with their white masters. But in the 1660s, Maryland and Virginia, they began making laws referring to slavery, using the word slavery. And children of slaves were slaves. Well, if you were a slave, by saying children, I mean the mother determined the status of the slave. Of course, the dad couldn't have a baby, so anyway. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. If the mother was free and the father was a slave, the child was free. But opportunities for freedom are restricted right and left, and so many of the states are going to pass laws where if you're a free black, you have to leave the state. And by 1680s, even though we still had small black populations, Virginia and Maryland are issuing even more restrictions. Bacon's Rebellion. I hope you enjoyed reading about that. That didn't give you quite all the story. It's by 1676, the best land in Virginia had been taken over by a very small elite group of friends of the governor, William Berkeley. And there were more and more indentures becoming free, and they were being pushed further and further west into inland Indian territory. Also, if you didn't come up with some land, you couldn't vote. This young man named Bacon arrives from England. He's an aristocrat, but there's no good land for him to have around Jamestown. And the book tells you he tried to get Berkeley to wage war against the Indians who were raiding the outpost farms. Well, since the farms were so far out, Berkeley tried in the beginning to get the governor to build forts to protect them. And they even went en masse to Jamestown, and they met with the governor, and the governor was a little bit frightened. He said, okay, we'll build some more forts out there to protect you. But it didn't happen. So then Berkeley realized that it wasn't going to happen. Now here's a picture of Berkeley. He looked a little sanctimonious, doesn't he? Had a little disagreement again, and he gets together a bunch of landless men, indentured servants, and some African Americans, and they begin demanding lower taxes and went to war against the Indians. The only way to get rid of them is to kill them. Well, they burned Jamestown, forced the governor to flee, and they plundered any plantations around. But the English, being what they are, they always seem to arrive just like Superman saves the day. But the English warships arrived, and they ended the rebellion. But meanwhile, Bacon had died of dysentery, so nothing was ever done to him. But most of them were punished. But they didn't seem to understand this wasn't a rebellion against the King of England. It wasn't a rebellion against anything other than they thought they were being treated unfairly. Governor Berkeley and his men had control of monopoly on all the trade, and had the best land, and you're put out in the boondocks where the Indians are going to get you. So the Virginia elite began limiting even more democracy and opportunity for the poor whites. The last thing we really want around here is for a landless white man to have a gun. They did open up more western land, and they're starting to turn more and more to black flavored. Like I said, they don't want any indentures, white indentures around, because you're going to have to give them a gun and turn them loose in 5 to 7 years. We don't need any more angry white men with guns. So the Chesapeake Bay area is going to become a society based totally on slavery. Between 1700 and 1750, slave population rose from 10% of the population to over half of the population. The Virginia legislature begins passing new slave codes defining slaves as property. And limiting even more freedom for blacks. Europeans, the Indians, and Africans all feared enslavement. Nobody wanted to be enslaved. And those that were, well, some tried to escape, some tried to contest with their owners, some tried to resist their masters legally. But slavery isn't the only problem we're facing in the late 1600s. We begin to see a rise in the Indians' resistance. The Native Americans in New England began attacking the English farms up there, and especially those they felt that were on Indian land. And settlers believed that the Indian chief called King Philip was a leader, but our history book says that wasn't true. The little YouTube says it was true. In less than 1 year, 90 English towns were totally destroyed. The locals fled to the coast to get away, and they made friends with some friendly Indians, and they got together and helped plan a counterattack. But meanwhile, in that 1 year, over 1,000 white settlers died. 3,000 Indians were killed, and many more hundreds were sold into slavery in the West Indies. Now, well, now with those Indians gone, we do have land opened up for white settlement. So maybe, let's see what the YouTube has to say.
King Philip, also known as Metacom or Metacomet, was the son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, legendary for aiding the Plymouth colony through their first years. Massasoit died in 1661, and the following year, Philip's brother Wamsutta, the next sachem, died soon after signing a peace treaty with the English. Suspicions were rampant that the English poisoned him. Tensions between the Pilgrims, Wampanoags, and other Native American tribes reached alarming levels as the English expanded their settlements to include more than 90 towns. The natives were continually being pushed further inland and away from the eastern seaboard. Naturally, the war was a result of a number of cumulative events, but the discovery of John Sassamon's body in the Assawamsett Pond is said to be the prime instigator. The English hung 3 of Philip's men for the supposed crime, which Philip saw as an affront to his jurisdiction. Philip raided the outpost settlement of Swansea, Massachusetts, and war was at hand. With each successive raid on English outposts, the larger Philip's confederacy of native alliances grew. Nearly half of the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies saw violence, and some settlers were taken into captivity. A sense of desperation began to grip many towns. But some colonists, under the command of Colonel Benjamin Church, began to employ Native American ranging tactics, such as tracking, camouflage, and surprise ambush. To the annoyance of Puritan authorities, Church also began to recruit Native Americans into his unit. The results were undeniable, as Church's unit began to capture enemy encampment after encampment. With the English victory at the Great Swamp Fight and the defeat of the Narragansett, the tide began to turn. The Native Americans suffered debilitating losses as captured loved ones were shipped to the West Indian slave trade, and many tribes continued to succumb to Western disease. Philip's alliances began to falter as the colonists gained more ground. Church and his men soon received intelligence on Philip's hideout and captured his wife and son. A desperate Philip was found at Mount Hope in Rhode Island, where Philip was shot and killed by John Alderman, a Native American. Philip's body was cut and quartered, and his head displayed on a stake at the Plymouth colony, where it is said to have remained for nearly 20 years. With Philip defeated and the English victorious, the landscape of the emerging nation was forever changed. The King Philip's War would become the prototype for nearly all the white and Native American conflicts for the next 200 plus years.
See, their text tells you that it wasn't King Philip who started it, but other histories say they did. Now, it's not just slave problems, and it's not just Indian problems. There are big problems back in the home country. I think your text states that this upheaval in England affected the colonies. And there was a struggle over power between the Parliament and the Crown that culminated in what we call the Glorious Revolution, or Bloodless Revolution, that established parliamentary supremacy and a Protestant succession to the throne. Well, under Charles II's rule, who had ruled, 25 years, and let Parliament kind of take the lead, they had expanded their powers, but when he died and his brother James II came to rule, he claiming rule by divine right and seeking religious toleration for the Catholics, etc. And fearing that the throne would go to his Catholic son, that baby that had mysteriously appeared in his wife's bed, they asked the daughter of the Protestant daughter, Mary and William, to take over. James II fled the invading army from William, and they took the throne. Then Parliament enacted what they call a Bill of Rights, giving Parliament control over taxation totally, establishing individual rights like trial by jury. And this peaceful coup, if you would, kind of assured the perpetuation of England's balanced constitutional monarchy, allowing the English subjects at the home country and in the colonies to, celebrate English rights and liberties no matter where they were. But before the Glorious Revolution, English rulers they tried to reduce, the colonies are getting kind of big for their britches. Charles II had even revoked Massachusetts' colonial charter for violations of the Navigation Act, claiming that they had been, smuggling. If you take a look at the map of the United States eastern coast, it's just full of little hills and valleys and parts harbors where you could just sneak a boat in there and unload, and there weren't enough English people around to enforce the rules, so we just ignored them. But he had combined Connecticut, Plymouth, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and West Jersey into the Dominion of New England, which was a super colony. It was going to be ruled by a governor, Sir Edmund Andros, who was unaccountable to anyone but the king. The charters of the colonies had been pulled, and many colonists were very happy with this glorious revolution. But meanwhile, the colony in New York, Jacob Leicester, a New York militia officer who was Dutch, took over and ran the colony successful for several years. I wish I'd given you more information about him. Jacob Leicester was not of the proper kind. Like I said, New York was a very autocratic colony. And Jacob Leicester was German. And what was worse, he was dark German. But he had Midas touch, and no matter what business he tried, it would succeed him. So the colony's leaders would be so mad they'd change the rules and change the regulations and change the zoning. So wherever he had a sawmill, they'd fix it so you couldn't have a sawmill, so he'd move somewhere else. And he was also in the New York militia. And you couldn't seem to keep the man down, and they were just going nuts. Well, the tale goes that after this revolution and William and Mary took over, the people who were in control of New York were not happy, especially the governor. And they were all in a bar drinking one night, and Leicester heard the governor slam the new king and queen, which was treason, and say he was really for James II. So he arrested him, or tried to arrest him. Well, he escaped and went to England. He ran the colony quite successfully for 2 years. The only thing he did is the Dutch were in the majority at the time, and there was a little bit of alienation between the Dutch and the English. Bless his heart, he tried. But the governor got to king and queen before anybody else did. And the king and queen issued orders for him to be arrested for treason. And he and his son-in-law were arrested for treason, tried, convicted. And because they were not nobility, they were hung, drawn, and quartered. About 10 years later, the true story came out. And William and Mary did reinstate the Leicester family's properties, but it didn't do Leicester and his son-in-law any good because they're dead and gone. Maryland, meanwhile, overthrew its governor and created a new Protestant-dominated government and getting rid of some of those Catholics. The super colony, of course, was dissolved. The Crown restored most charters, and Massachusetts was incorporated into the Plymouth colony. Now, land ownership was not mandatory for church membership. But you did have to own land for voting, but you didn't have to be a member of a certain church, which was good. Now, Puritans at this time believed in magic and astrology and witchcraft and the devil's work, and witchcraft was punishable by hanging in Europe as well as the colonies. And the irony is that most of the people who were always accused of being witches, and it was done in other states too. I don't think it happened in South Carolina, but I know it did in Kentucky and Virginia. They were older women who were outspoken, economically independent, and usually living alone or didn't have a husband or a man around. And they usually were property owners. 1691, Salem, Massachusetts. It charged, oh boy, my spell check didn't work on this slide. Massachusetts charged 150 people, most of them women, as witches. And of those charged, 19 were hanged and one man was pressed to death. The people doing the accusing were ministers, children, who, there's been so many theories, did they get a hold of some bread that had an hallucinogenic in it? Were the children really possessed? We don't know. There's not enough evidence to go one way that you can believe that they really were possessed or that they got hold of something that made them act strange and run around barking like a dog. And when they saw the attentions they were getting, and no matter what they said they were believed, it kept on. Because when you stop and think about 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old girls living in that time, I mean, you didn't have an iPod, you didn't have a TV, you didn't have a cell phone, you probably couldn't read or write. Well, what were you going to do? But finally, they kind of stepped over their bounds, and they accused the governor's wife. And that's, at that point in time, the Massachusetts governor stepped in, and the authorities ended the trials and released most of them in jails. And the types of proof that they used for these trials was, my cow stopped giving milk after she passed. Or I can see a specter even if you can't. I see a ghost hanging over your head. Or you can't say the Lord's Prayer. And of course, none of this would ever be allowed in any courts today. But in the end, it did cause a bit of an interest in finding a scientific explanation for some of these events that were unexplainable. Sure, there's something more going on. And when I was young, your age, nobody wanted to be anything but pure 100% of something. And nowadays, if you had a witch in the background, I mean, nowadays you'd be really bragging about, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was arrested as a warlock or something. You're pleased to have something different in your background, but things change. It's just an illustration from Cotton Mather's book about witches riding broomsticks. And did y'all ever watch that Bewitched, where Samantha was a good witch? Her mother wasn't so good. I always thought that was so funny. Oh, and if you ever saw the Bewitched episode where Samantha and Darren were in Salem, and she found an enchanted bed warmer. It was like a long stick with I missed my blackboard, where the pan opened up and they would put hot coals in there and they'd rub these hot coals over the sheets so the king and queen wouldn't have to get into cold sheets. And the theory is that they put a baby in this pan without the coals, of course, and they delivered the baby to the queen this way. That's why it was called a bedpan baby. But even with all the problems, the English colonies are growing. The Spanish and French colonies are still very powerful, but very quickly the English are going to exceed them in population, because we went from 265,000 in 1700 to, in less than 70 short years, to 2.3 million. But in the late 18th century, non-English immigrants are arriving. The arrival of English immigrants are decreased a little bit, and more than 40% of those migrating were, shall we say, unfree or indentures, which is a nice way of saying slaves. But there's also an increasing number of professionals and skilled craftsmen coming into the country, which is good. Thousands came in from Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some convicts were sent over by Mother England, and 100,000 Germans arrived, and they were Catholic. But there's still some sets of dissenting Protestants over there that are coming over. And most of these people tended to settle in New York, Pennsylvania, and the southern colonies. Now, I'm not talking about Charleston and Savannah. I'm talking about the backwoods and like in the high mountains of North Carolina and in the high country of South Carolina. And sometimes they come over in a whole group of, one ethnic group. And when they did that, they tended to stay in the group. So the American colonies began to be very, very diverse. In most of the colonies, their churches were Congregational or Anglican, but religious toleration is starting to grow, especially in the Great Awakening, which we get into in the next chapter. But we see Lutherans and Mennonites and Anabaptists and Moravians and Seventh-day Baptists and Presbyterians and even some Jews and some Muslims. And they were free to worship however they pleased as long as they paid their taxes to support the official church. But they couldn't hold public office. Now, this is the same rules that the Muslims had when they would take over a country. You could keep your religion back in the 12, 13, 1400s, but you had to pay taxes to support the Muslim church. Excuse me, not church. This is just showing the ethnic diversity. As you can see, a little bit of green in there. Highland Scotch. The French and the Highland Scotch is hard to distinguish between. But for the most part, the pink is English. As you can see, it's solid English in the New England colonies. The what we call the middle colonies, New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they're more diverse. But you get down south, you got the hard-headed Southerners. This might be interesting to you. Breaks it down to how many came in that 75-year period total, who came as slaves, who came as indentured, who came as convicts, who came as free. And you can see Ireland is sending over convicts and indentures, which I think is a nice way of saying slaves. Germany didn't send any convicts, but they did send over indentured as well as free. England and Wales, look at that, very few free, mostly indentured and some convicts. Scotland, for a while we were a dumping ground, and if you didn't have room for them or something for them to do in your home country, they dissented against the church or the government, sent them to the Americas. The newly arriving colonists, especially those that came in free, and we're not talking about the convicts or the slaves, they equated owning land with liberty. And of course, you want to own land, and what does this do? The land out there that you own is probably already in use by Indians. So as the colonists are growing and wanting more land, you're challenging and threatening the Native Americans. But the Native Americans are not the same as they were when we came over in the 1600s. Not are they using, but they've become dependent upon European goods, and they're also going to become very involved in imperial wars with Spain and France and England very shortly. And of course, these newly arriving settlers, they're putting more and more pressure on the governments to open up more land for settlement. And in places where once there was peaceful relations between the natives and the settlers, relations are going to disintegrate, even in wonderful Pennsylvania. But by the mid-1700s, the different regions of the colonies had very distinct economic and social orders. And you had your New England colonies, you had your middle colonies, and you had your southern colonies. And even in those areas, you had distinctions. For instance, on the New England frontier, you had families with small farms, and they used their own families for labor, but they were rapidly growing. The older middle colonies of the breadbasket of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, big commercial farms, and they used non-family laborers, which is a nice way of saying slaves. Very few colonists lived in the port cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And even though they were big cities, for instance, Philadelphia in 1770 only had 30,000, and that was the largest city in North America. But the cities, which were considered large at the time, they were trade centers. Meanwhile, Great Britain is becoming a leading producer of, shall we say, inexpensive consumer goods. And the colonists, with the desire and the need, they're beginning to buy items that were once considered luxury. Used to be if you couldn't make it, you couldn't get it. And the urban artisans, the city artisans, they made their own furniture. They had jewelers and silversmiths and weavers and blacksmiths and coopers and construction workers. And these people, they owned their own tools, and usually either a small workshop or sometimes they would have a shop with their home above it. So basically you'd say their shop was in their home. But these people, they were economically independent and quite free when you compare them to an unskilled worker who had to work for wages. But this great Atlantic Ocean, it's become a highway linking the colonies and the economies with other empires. For instance, we grew sugar and tobacco and we marketed it in Europe. Meanwhile, the bankers in London are financing the slave trade. Spain is spending gold and silver and importing things because they don't do much work. But we in North America, we ship farm products to Britain and the West Indies. We exported fish and grains to Europe. We also imported slaves and rum from Africa. And we also began building over 33% of Great Britain's trading ships because in New England. And this is just a quick picture that was showing you how the Atlantic trade's expanding and shipbuilding becomes a very major enterprise in the colonies. And it was one that we were given a bounty to do because we had the wood to build the ships. So with all this, we begin to see a colonial elite emerging. And which is not surprising. It happens in every society. The elite begins to dominate politics and society. And it's only natural because now, like you and me, we're common folks. We've got to make a living. I'm busy out here growing on this small farm and trying to make a living and building some things the wife needs in the house and taking care of the kids and going to church on Sundays. I don't have time to go into Philadelphia or Boston or Charleston and talk politics. While I'm away, the Indians may attack my family. We may have a storm and I lose my crops. But my neighbor next door, he's got a plantation. He's got slaves to do all this work. He's got the time to go into town and discuss politics. Now, he knows what we need out here, so I'll just have him be my representative. So it happens quite easily. You don't have the time to go to the state capitol to take care of business. You've got to go to work. But your next door neighbor who has money doesn't have to go to work. So he can go to town and do it. So without even realizing what we're doing, the elite are taking over and we're helping them do it. But the gap between the rich and poor is growing, which is nothing new. The New England has a very powerful merchant upper class. And the Chesapeake Bay colonies in the lower South, they're dominated by the big slave plantations, which were producing rice right now, and especially in Carolina. You had enormously wealthy planters, and they're basically ruling the colony's government. They're not actually in the government. No one wanted to be in the government. They just decided on who was going to be elected in the government. So we didn't have a titled aristocracy, but the landed men and women of commercial wealth came to control most of the colony's political, economic, and social life. I can even say it, Anglicization, basically means the American colonies are becoming more and more Anglicized or more English. Repeating what I said in the first couple of slides, the colonists saw themselves as English, not Americans. And the very wealthy colonists, such as in the big cities, and especially in Charleston, they imitated the British fashions, their behavior, the same type of goods they were consuming, the buildings that they would build. And the wealthiest of all the colonists were the South Carolina planters, and Charleston was the wealthiest city in the North America. Philadelphia was the largest population-wise, but it was Charleston that held the economic reins. They had theaters, they had literary societies, they had a very ostentatious social events. They did it up lavishly, very lavish lifestyle, with a lot of imported goods from Europe. But unfortunately, the wealth in South Carolina was very highly concentrated in very few hands. And these elites believed that freedom for them was based in their power as superiors able to rule over dependents, which included their wives, their children, and slaves, and anybody else. And the society was going to be held together by their influence. They also believed that your position could be determined by your dress and manners and what you possessed. And of course, none of them liked manual labor. They favored leisure time, and the freedom from labor defined them as gentlemen. Now, the original definition of gentleman was one who was educated, who didn't do the work but told you how to do it. And it was just one of the social classes they had in Europe. The gentleman and gentlewoman did not do their own work, but they knew how to do it, so they could tell you how to do it. But poverty is increasing in our country. And granted, it's not as bad as in England, but the slaves here lived in very impoverished conditions. And the number of landless men are growing, and they're becoming dependent upon their own labor, or they're becoming part of the proletariat, and they're going to be wage laborers. Now, the better offs, the upper class, they thought the poor was responsible for being poor, and because it's their own fault, I'm not giving help. Now, out in the country, in the farming area, a lot of those people would help their own if someone got down the luck. But most Americans were what we consider the middle rank. We don't really have a middle class yet, but it's coming along. It's middle rank. Now, 2/3 of the free Americans owned land and viewed land ownership as a right and precondition of freedom. Now, we're not talking about 2/3 of the population. 2/3 of the free white Americans. percentage goes down when you talk about that. And these landowners, I mean, they resented the governments or even Native Americans saying you can't have any more land. They disliked personal dependence totally, because their understanding of freedom was someone who did not rely on someone else for their livelihood. You took care of yourself. And the family was the center of life in the 18th century household economy, because everybody there worked, men, women, and children. And in the beginning, they all focused on food to survive, but as commerce expanded in the late 1700s, more and more farmers began producing for market. But a woman's work is never done. The woman raised the kids. She worked in the home. She cleaned. She cooked. She canned. She sewed. She educated the children. She took care of the home garden. She slopped the pigs. She milked the cows. And she also worked not only in their own local garden, but in the fields with her husband. And despite all the new consumer goods that were replacing the things that had previously been made in the home to make the home a better place and easier for the wife, a woman's workload increased. It's going to be kind of like the 20s and 30s when we get everything so electrified. The woman then had to go from a coal stove to a gas stove. She had electric lighting. She had electric fans, electric irons. Supposedly give her more time. It did. It gave her more time to go out and get a job as well as doing the homework. It's just one of the many chores a woman had to do, and of course it's a very romanticized. I doubt if she had that nice of clothing. If a woman had two outfits, she was lucky, one for every day and one for church or for winter. At least she's sitting down doing this when she's trying to read. It doesn't look like a Bible to me, but like I said, it's a very romanticized picture. By the mid-1700s, the British colonies, as I said, were diverse in peoples, culture, and social organizations, and the elites dominating politics and economics. But the American colonists, the Englishmen living in America, enjoyed the highest per capita income in the world. We had a higher birth rate, we had a longer life expectancy, and we had a growing demand for consumer goods that were once considered luxury goods. We were freer and had more opportunities than anywhere else in the world. However, there was that group of men and women who enjoyed no freedom or opportunities, slaves. Now, this YouTube is John Green, and he's going to give you his interpretation of what I have just told you. And I have to admit, he does have a rather unique style about him.
I'm from a farm family, and I'd like to know how you can say that Keystone XL will be the safest pipe.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to cram 150 years of American history into one video. Why? Well, many American history classes don't cover the colonial period at all because most major American history tests have like one question about it. Mr. Green, so this isn't going to be on the test? That's awesome because I have some flirtatious notes to exchange with Jessica Alvarez. Yeah, me from the past. So listen, would you rather do well on one test or lead a richer, more productive life as a result of having a better understanding of the complicated factors that led to the creation of the greatest nation in history? Stan, can I get a libertage? So listen up, Mr. Past. It's time to bask in our own greatness. And by greatness, I mean morally dubious people who would have been just fine without us. So contrary to popular mythology, colonial America was more than just Jamestown in Massachusetts. There was, for instance, New Amsterdam. The tale goes the Dutch traders bought the island of Manhattan from Lenape Indians for $24 in 1624. That isn't quite true, but it contains a truth. The Dutch traders who founded their colony were businessmen, and New Amsterdam was above everything else a commercial venture. This is still true in New York, actually. I mean, Manhattan is all about Wall Street. In fact, Crash Course writer and history teacher Raoul Meyer is believed to be the last person living on the island of Manhattan who does not work for an investment bank. So the Dutch let anyone into New Amsterdam who could help them turn a profit, including Jews and even Quakers. But they didn't like Indians very much. In fact, they drove them out of the colony. But anyway, the $24 the Lenape supposedly got for New England was $24 more than the Dutch got when the English took over the colony in 1664 by sailing 4 frigates into the harbor and asking for the colony in a threatening voice. So New Amsterdam became New York, which was a mixed blessing. The population doubled in the decade after the English takeover, but English rule meant less economic freedom for women who, under the Dutch, were able to inherit property and conduct business for themselves. And under the English, free black people lost a lot of the jobs they'd been able to hold under the Dutch. Dutch. Things were better in Pennsylvania, so much so that it was known as the best poor man's country, which admittedly in the 17th century was a low bar to jump over. Given by Charles II to this guy, William Penn, in 1681, Pennsylvania was a huge tract of land roundabout here. The land included contemporary Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey, but we made an editorial decision not to talk about New Jersey here on Crash Course due to my long-standing anti-New Jersey bias. So Penn wanted his colony to be a haven for Quakers because he was a Quaker, as you know if you've ever seen a container of Quaker oats. Quakers were a pretty tolerant bunch, except when it came to slavery, which they opposed vehemently. And under Penn's leadership, the colony showed remarkable religious toleration and also an amazing respect for Indian communities, but then, after Penn was gone, yeah, the usual. In 1737, Pennsylvania colonists perpetrated one of the most famous frauds of colonial America, the walking purchase. Indians agreed to cede a tract of land bounded by the distance a man could walk in 36 hours, but the clever Governor James Logan hired a bunch of fast runners who marked out territory much larger than the Indians anticipated. Quakers had to resort to such tricks because they were pacifists. I should also mention that they weren't particularly fond of loose living. The government prevented swearing and drunkenness, for instance, but, it was still pretty great compared to the other colonies. More than half of the male population was eligible to vote, and Pennsylvania's dual promise of religious freedom and cheap land attracted a lot of German immigrants. Well, I should say German-speaking immigrants. There was, of course, not a Germany at the time, as many viewers of Crash Course World History have pointed out to me. And now let us venture south, where we will find many mosquito-borne illnesses and somewhat less abolitionist sentiments. In 1663, English King Charles II gave 8 proprietors the right to set up a colony just north of the Spanish-controlled Florida to serve as a buffer. This became South Carolina, and its original settlers came from the sugar colony of Barbados, which helps to explain why they were so awesome at slavery. They tried to enslave the Indians and ship them to the Caribbean, but when that didn't work out, they began to import African slaves. We're going to talk a lot more about slavery in future episodes, but for now, just bear in mind it sucked. Okay, so in the last quarter of the 17th century, the British colonies in the Americas experienced a series of crises. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I get the author of the document, I get it right, no shock, I get it wrong, shock. Okay, we accuse Sir William Berkeley as guilty of each and every one of the same, and as one who has traitorously attempted, violated, and injured His Majesty's interests here by a loss of a great part of his colony and many of his faithful, loyal subjects, by him betrayed and in a barbarous and shameful manner exposed to the incursions and murder of the heathen. And we do further declare these ensuing persons in this list to have been his wicked and pernicious counselors. Both wicked and pernicious. Those are some terrible counselors. Okay, so this guy clearly hated William Berkeley, who I happen to know was governor of Virginia. Particularly upset about the colonists being incurred upon and murdered by the heathen, that is, the Native Americans. I have a guess, but I'm not brimming with confidence. The one person I know who hated William Berkeley was Nathaniel Bacon. Yes! Yes, yes! No shock for me and no pleasure for you, you schadenfreudic Crash Course viewers. So Nathaniel Bacon arrived in Virginia in 1673 and led an armed uprising against Governor Berkeley just 3 years later. And just to be clear, he was mad not because Berkeley did a poor job protecting colonists from Indians, but because Berkeley wouldn't allow them to kill more Indians and take more land. Berkeley had already given all the really good land to his cronies, those aforementioned wicked and pernicious counselors, leaving men like Bacon with serious beef. Before the rebellion was quelled by the arrival of English warships, Bacon burned Jamestown and made himself ruler of Virginia and looted Berkeley's supporters' land. 23 of the rebels were hanged, but not Bacon, who died shortly after taking control from, you guessed it, dysentery. Dang it, dysentery! It's called history, not dysentery-story. Bacon's rebellion is sometimes portrayed as an early example of lower-class artisans and would-be farmers rising up against the corrupt British elite, which I guess kind of. But the biggest effects of the rebellion were, 1, a shift away from indentured servants to slaves, and 2, a general desire by the English crown to control the colonies more. Okay, so in 1686, King James II really tried to put the hammer down by consolidating Connecticut, Plymouth, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, and East and West Jersey into one big mega colony called the Dominion of New England. Its near-dictatorial ruler was former New York Governor Edmund Andros, who proceeded to appoint his own officials and lay his own taxes without even consulting any of the elected assemblies. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on your perspective, a major event in British history reversed this policy, the Glorious Revolution. Now, thankfully, this isn't Crash Course British history, or it would quickly turn into Crash Course John is Bored history. But the upshot is that Britain got a fancy new royal family from Holland, which sparked uprisings in the colonies, and Andros was thrown into a Boston jail as the colonies reasserted their independence. And these new guys imposed the English Toleration Act of 1690, which decreed that all Protestants could worship freely. As Toleration Acts go, this one wasn't that tolerant. I mean, it still discriminated against Jews, but it did mark the end of the Puritan experiment. No longer would membership in a Congregationalist church be a requirement for voting in general court elections. Property ownership would now be the determining factor. And Massachusetts would now have a governor from England, not from a company board residing inside the colony itself. This was the context for one of the most talked about events in colonial history, the Salem witch trials. A lot of ink has been expended on this incident, and the interpretations of it are numerous and controversial, so I'm just going to point out that when the witch trials, which claimed the lives of 14 of the nearly 150 women and men accused of witchcraft, happened in 1691, New England as a colony had basically just failed in its religious mission. The Tolerance Act meant that people in Massachusetts would have to accept even Quakers as virtual equals. Quakers! So it's not surprising that colonists would look for scapegoats or that their male leaders would seek to reassert their gender dominance. Okay, to talk about colonial American economics, let's go to the thought bubble. Most colonists were farmers or worked on farms, and they were mostly small, unlike the giant plantations that predominated in the Caribbean. Since New England contains relatively little in the way of tropical diseases and was increasingly free of Native Americans, the colonial population there skyrocketed, so fast that families began to run out of land, so second and third sons increasingly had to go make their way in growing coastal cities. We'll talk about this more in future episodes, but for now, let's just note the idea of a person owning a small farm and the idea of freedom are pretty closely intertwined in the early part of American history. It's more of an amber waves of grain place than a behold this metropolis place. In fact, they were richer than any other colonial elites. Were they rich enough to dominate the Constitutional Convention? Time will tell. Now, not everyone was a farmer or a slave. There were growing numbers of artisans in the colonies. Although British colonial policy discouraged local manufacturing, the growing population in America meant that there was certain to be a market for locally produced goods, especially clothing and metalwork. Remember, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, Paul Revere, was a silversmith. Thanks, Todd Level. So that variety of jobs leads us nicely to our last topic today, colonial society. Although Americans like to think of themselves as classless, pun intended, that's not really the case. I mean, the colonies definitely had an elite ruling class, especially in the South, that did what it could to perpetuate itself. George Washington's father and grandfather were both justices of the peace, an important role in colonial times, meaning that George Washington had deeply elite roots. So that was the top of colonial society, and at the bottom was a growing number of poor people. While it's never good to be poor, it was much better to be poor in the colonies than it was in England or much of the rest of Europe, which is why people kept indenturing themselves to get here. America had lots of food, and there was the possibility of maybe someday getting some land, provided you didn't die of dysentery. Oh, and also provided you weren't a woman. Married women in 18th century colonial America generally couldn't own property, and husbands usually willed their land to their sons and their personal items to their daughters, meaning that almost all landowners were male. In the earliest days of colonization, when everyone was needed to ensure the survival of the colonies, women had a greater role in the economy, although they were still expected to be wives and mothers above all else. Male dominance was written into law and solidified in practice. Women's work was mostly confined to the home, and especially for lower-class women, it involved a lot of drudgery. As one woman, Mary Cooper, wrote in her diary in 1769, "I am dirty and distressed, almost wearied to death. This day is 40 years since I left my father's house and come here, and here have I seen little else but hard labor and sorrow." And that's actually a good place to end, because it reminds us that history is about much more than the lives of kings like James II and rebels like Nathaniel Bacon. And while history classes and exams tend to focus on those kinds of men, and they were mostly men, the real story of history is about regular people trying to take care of their families and not die. The colonial era often gets skipped for its lack of large-scale drama, but those small-scale dramas can be found in abundance. Next week, we'll go back to all that great men and dramatic events crap when we start talking about the American Revolution. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Mower. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Meyer, and myself, and our graphic.
Thought for a minute I wasn't going to be able to get it done. One more. Your next chapter, Chapter 4, is Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for the Empire to 1763, which is an extremely important date and one of the very few I'll ever ask you to remember, 1763. It's going to get us involved in colonial wars and tell you a lot about slavery. It's also a very long chapter. It's 41 pages long and covers an awful lot of information, so I'll try to talk a little bit slower for that one. Now catch your breath, work your short quiz and 2 essay questions for this chapter while the info is still fresh in your mind, and I would strongly suggest you do this before you tackle Chapter 4.